My name is Dr. Ryan Holsapple. Welcome to the Self Soul Spirit podcast. And today I want to talk to you about why psychology needs a model for consciousness. Or, in other words, why does psychology need an understanding of consciousness? And we can peel back consciousness into layers, right? We have the epistemological layers, and then we have the ontological layers. Often in psychology, what you see is this epistemological understanding of consciousness, which is really the study of knowledge, the study of how we know what we know. Well, obviously, consciousness is crucial to how we know what we know. So consciousness is implicit in our epistemology when we're talking about psychology, when we're talking about human behavior, when we're talking about motivation or motivational systems or salience in terms of what's relevant to us in our environment. And that is just this implicit assumption that we have to have some sort of underlying perception or metacognition that allows us to interact with a world. Well, today I'm going to tell you why that's not quite enough. We can have all these epistemological assumptions about what we know and how we know and that consciousness exists, but really, how does it arise? Does it arise as a byproduct of all these mechanistic, algorithmic, biomechanical processes, or does it arise as more of an innate force, as a basic part of the universe? I mean, that matters. Now, a lot of psychologists don't realize why that matters, and I'm here to tell you why it matters. It matters because your ontological understanding of a consciousness, that is to say, your base reality understanding, with the underlying isness of the world, of reality, the structure and fabric of what makes life, what makes the world what it is. If we understand consciousness as an innate property of the universe versus an emergent property, we will actually have a very different psychology. And today I'm going to talk to you about why it's important for us to lay the foundation for seeing consciousness as an innate part of the universe. In fact, the universe as consciousness would be a more appropriate way of putting it. Now, this flies in the face of a materialistic or a physicalistic worldview, which really does believe that everything is reducible to these micro particles, right? And the fact of the matter is that reducibility has not been proven, and the evidence for it diminishes by the day. We now know from quantum physics that there's no such thing as actual real space. Everything's connected. Because everything's connected, there's no such thing as time either, because what happens over here could simultaneously be connected to something happening light years away. Well, if it's simultaneous, that means it's faster than the speed of light. That means that time and space are not fundamental parts of reality, meaning they're not at that deepest ontological layer of reality. Remember, when we're talking about ontology, we're talking about root being. We're talking about the structure, the basic being of reality, the underlying isness of reality. Whereas in epistemology, we're talking about how do we explore reality? How do we know what we know, right? And in psychology, we need both. When I'm sitting in front of a client, you might think it's not so important that you and this client have a deep understanding of consciousness as reality. And on an intellectual level, I might grant you some of that. The client doesn't necessarily have to understand the deep theory. But what the client does have to understand is that consciousness is life force. Life force is soul. Soul is the core of who they are. If they understand that, they have a chance of living a soul-directed life. If they don't understand that and they see themselves as a robot, they see themselves as a consciousness that just happened to explode into existence as an accidental byproduct of all these working pieces, they're not going to have the same sense of therapeutic meaning. So implicitly, there does have to be an understanding of soul. There does have to be an understanding of consciousness. I always like to say that the spirit, the great spirit, the universe, that's one big soul. And each living entity is a soul within that big soul. There's all these disassociated souls or these individualized souls. So, looking at consciousness in this basic, fundamental way transforms the entire course of psychology. That is why Dr. Strachan, in his self-soul spirit model, which is now also my self-soul spirit model, starts with cosmology, starts with the forming of planets that are livable, that have been fine-tuned to have life on them, because the universe is fine-tuned for life. And how do physicists and quantum physicists that are committed to materialism explain this fact? Well, there must be millions of parallel universes, multiple universe theory where life doesn't exist, so we can explain the probabilities of how one happened to pop out that did exist. I mean, the parsimony of that argument just to save your materialism is laughable, honestly. But that's okay. What's not laughable is finding an argument that can say, hey, consciousness runs throughout all of existence. Does that mean that everything that we perceive is a conscious entity? No, because consciousness co-creates as a matrix of multiple consciousnesses. It co-creates what we perceive as objects that might not have consciousness, like this desk, for example. I don't infer that this desk is conscious, that it's having experience, but let's define consciousness more closely, because it's all too easy to get this argument so wildly confused by just not understanding what I'm saying by the word consciousness. First of all, there's this thing that we as human beings with a highly evolved neocortex have. It's called metacognition. It's the ability to know that we know, to see ourselves thinking, feeling, planning, to reflect upon our actions, to monitor and control ourselves, to use the word I in a self-narrative identity. I am Ryan. I am currently doing a podcast on consciousness. I am planning to say this next. Okay? That's metacognition. It's the ability to monitor, control, to self-reflect, to have a narrative sense of identity. Metacognition. That is an extension of evolution. That is not necessarily the root of consciousness, and consciousness doesn't necessarily need metacognition. I'd like you to think of a microorganism or a small, an animal that does not have the same abilities as those that have a more evolved neocortex, that is able to move around in an environment, that is able to feel, to sense in a way that is creative and act in a way that is creative without necessarily thinking, I am the one doing this, or without necessarily having the same level of metacognition that we have, or any for that matter. Maybe it's just cognition. Maybe it's not metacognition, right? Because metacognition comes with this evolved neocortex. Now, how might that look? Well, you can see, feel, act, perceive without knowing that you're seeing, feeling, acting, and perceiving. You're just doing it. You're feeling, you're seeing, you're acting, and perceiving. It's just happening. You're doing it. It's consciousness in action. When consciousness bends back towards itself with this metacognitive awareness, that is a gift that we have as a human species. It's a wonderful product of evolution. So consciousness, what am I saying at the root? I'm saying at the root, consciousness is directed, it's intentional, and it's phenomenal, meaning that it's based on experience. It has a phenomenology. So it's not just one or the other. You know, it's not just phenomenal and it's not just intentional. They both come with a package. Experiential and intentional. Now you can see why this is so important for psychology. And in Self, Soul, Spirit, we say that the universe intentionally strives for functionality. And functionality means adaptive, intelligent design. Not in a deistic, deterministic way where everything's mapped out beforehand, because the universe can make stuff up as it goes along. It can be a great experimenter. If you study a great theoretical biologist by the name of Stuart Kauffman, he convincingly shows us why life in the biosphere and possibly the entire universe is so creative. And the reason for this is because we don't know what the parameters are. We can't mathematically predefine those parameters, meaning we can't put boundaries around the phase space because we don't know what will evolve, how it will evolve, and what will react to those evolutionary components. He uses the great example of the evolution of the swim bladder in fish. Well, what does the swim bladder give you? It gives you a new function, okay? Key there is functionality. The new function is neutral buoyancy in the water column. Okay, well, now a bacteria or a parasite can evolve to live in that swim bladder. Now, what can evolve as a reaction to that bacteria or parasite? Well, dozens of other things can also co-evolve. Predators that eat those bacteria or parasites, for example. In essence, we have this cascading creativity where we have what he calls these new actualities and these adjacent possibilities. Now, I want you to really closely pay attention to this because that does not happen with computer algorithms. The phase space is much more tightly controlled. Federico Fagin, in his book Irreducible, talks about this quite extensively. That the difference between a machine, a robot, and a conscious person or a conscious organism is wild and drastic and stark because the algorithmic reality is so much more predefined. Yes, is there wiggle room for unexpected events? Absolutely, but those unexpected events are because the computer exists within an unpredictable environment, and to some extent, meaning that we can't always control everything that comes in and out. But the system in and of itself is a deterministic system. An algorithm in and of itself is deterministic. There are parameters, and it is responding within those parameters. Nature, evolution, not deterministic. Biology, not deterministic. Consciousness, no, that's where free will comes from. Free will is what gives us the ability to act within parameters, but the thing is that the parameters can change. Once the parameters of a system change, the system itself also can evolve. That's consciousness, okay? So in Self, Soul, Spirit, we say consciousness is life force, is soul, because we believe and we argue that soul is the driving factor of existence. Soul is what is propelling evolution forward, not just passive natural selection. And by the way, there's now more and more evidence showing that natural selection is not simply the sole force of evolutionary processes, that there's a deep creative cellular intelligence. Natural selection is always post hoc. Natural selection is, it worked, so it stayed. Well, that's somewhat of an outmoded way of thinking. It's not just that. That's a component. That definitely is a brilliant observation by Darwin and those who came after him and how they refined it. However, what we now know that is so powerful is that nature experiments intelligently. Now, we can do backflips and spin around and do everything we want to do to try to avoid saying consciousness, but I'm just going to come out and say it. Nature is consciousness. Life is consciousness. And I've been fortunate to have this mentoring and have this drilled into my brain through many conversations and debates and arguments with Dr. Strachan until I got to the point where I saw exactly what he was talking about in terms of this cellular consciousness that comes straight from the universe. Now with quantum physics and the developments that we are seeing, there's more evidence than ever for the importance of the observer, for the importance of consciousness. And what does consciousness do? Well, consciousness acts within what's called, again, from Kaufman, an enabling constraint. Now, I've borrowed this term from Kaufman because I think it's brilliant for consciousness. An enabling constraint is the space of the organism. I have an arm. My arm's not a wing, but I can do all these different things with an arm. While in some ways you could look at it as constraining, and other ways you could look at as incredibly empowering in terms of what I can do, what I can grasp, how I can move, right? So these enabling constraints give consciousness this space to explore and create. Well, what else is an enabling constraint? Well, you could look at all the organs of the body as enabling constraints, what they allow us to do. So things that on one hand seem like a limitation, when you look deeper, are also profoundly enabling, but they specify the world that we live in. Human beings walking down a trail in nature, because of their distinct enabling constraints and their organs of perception, will have a very particular view of what's relevant. There's a trail. The trail's for walking. There's a bench for sitting. There's a pier for standing and viewing. These are all these perceptual processes that where the organism interacts with the environment. It will now be a bird. Put yourself in the bird's eye view. Your whole field of perception changes. Or be a bat with echolocation. Your whole field of perception changes because your enabling constraints are different. Well, now let's extrapolate that to personality, to psychology. Now you can start seeing why I put this conscious life force so important at the beginning of our psychology. That's why I'm saying we cannot have psychology without these philosophical underpinnings, without a root establishment. Otherwise, we end up with something like the behaviorism of old, where we are just looking at behavior and we have no intrinsic motivation. There's no consciousness underneath the behavior. It's just stuff happening. Well, guess what that is? That's a computer. Well, we're not computers. We feel things. What we feel matters. What we see matters. What we perceive matters. It all matters, okay? So let's extrapolate it to personality. Well, your personality traits, we're going into self now. I started today with soul, consciousness. We're going into self. Your personality traits give you this parameter space. So they give you these enabling constraints. What do you perceive as interesting? What's salient to you? What's relevant to you, right? And if we have all these multiple subpersonalities, in other words, we inherit these genetic subsystems which develop in life through experience and through nurturing and through proactive engagement because they have their own agenda, they have their own feelings, they have their own motivations, right? Well, they are these organs of perception. They are the multiplicity of selves, and each one has its own enabling constraints. So if I see the world in terms of music or art or creativity, my perception is going to be animated, and the world's going to come back at me through that salient field. Whereas if another part of me has a totally different set of agendas, whether it be I'm a manager and I'm an entrepreneur and I want to build this company and I want to become successful, I'm going to see the world in that lens of creativity rather than maybe the more artistically defined. Or if I'm a scientist and I want to know how things work, what they do, I'm going to be seeing the world through that lens. So our intention and our motivational implicitness, right? It's not just nature or nurture, but it's what is given over to us as intrinsically salient and how it develops through the nurturing experiences will become these enabling factors for our perception. And they will distinguish what is salient for consciousness. So if you imagine we have a soul, and you imagine that we have a body, that's not hard to do. And we imagine that we have all these subpersonalities that are a part of that soul-body union. Well, the consciousness that is the core being is shared with all these multiple parts, and the multiple parts will connect and will look through that consciousness. They won't have it all. They'll have the ability to take some consciousness for their focus, for their attention. And all these different parts can use the metacognitive capacities of the same brain so that they can come in and out of that first person narrative identity. And so this idea of consciousness is so crucial because now the subpersonalities share in that experience. And they too are not these linear algorithmic forces. No. These subpersonalities have their own motivated, creative abilities. They're not totally predictable. They have a preset motivational interest. Some people just want to con everybody, and they have this subpersonality that just wants to see how much can I get out of this person? How much can I get out of this situation? Right? So that's going to paint the way they see the world and how they interact with the world and how they're motivated and what's rewarding and what they want to avoid. I mean, it's really that simple. Other people are athletically motivated, right? And so they're going to see the world through, oh my God, see that boulder over there? I bet you I could climb that boulder. Or, see that basketball court over there? Let's go find a basketball and shoot around. Whereas somebody who's not motivated by that is not going to see the same things. Now, the cool thing about subpersonalities is we can have all these interests, sometimes competing even, inside of us. And that's what's so interesting about psychology. So let me back up a little bit. Now imagine we took consciousness as life force out and we put in computer algorithm as psychology. Boring, not gonna be very therapeutic, not gonna be very useful to the human psyche, because it doesn't correspond with reality. It's not that it's just lame, it's that it doesn't really work. It doesn't resonate. Why doesn't it resonate? Because it's not what is. What is resonates. So when we look at consciousness in this powerful, fundamental way, we have the most beautiful opportunity to extend it into our psychology. And if I think if more psychologists can start to look at their fundamental ontology, see how consciousness fits in, and then come back up to subpersonalities, you can then start treating the human with much more dynamism and robustness. And we'll get even better results, even on a scientific level. Because our underlying assumptions can very much constrain where we can go next. And yet if we open those wide and we find something that really sticks in terms of its functionality, we can soar. We can soar with these fundamental concepts, which are based in actuality, in my estimation, in my view. So consciousness running through the psyche, running through the human psyche. We have these subpersonalities. Yes, they are partly genetic. Yes, they also nurture. They are genetic and nurture, right? Not just one or the other. And through that experience of being nurtured, they always have this consciousness, whether or not it's always metacognitive, whether or not there's always this self-reflective understanding in any given moment. They're always experiencing something. We're having multiple experiences at once often. It's just that those parts of us that have the most strength of energy at the time are the ones who take it and the ones who have the power over behavior. As right now I am teaching, I'm a teacher. I'm also a philosopher. But these are natural subpersonalities I brought into the world. They got nurtured through the right mentoring, the right schooling, the right opportunities. So I don't know how I would have ended up in a different environment. I know my consciousness would adapt and find its own functionality in that environment. However, I can't say how I would have neurologically developed and how my traits would have carried on and how these subpersonalities would be given form and function. So it could be a totally different twist on the same template. I don't know. That's the beauty, is we only know what is, as Robert Plowman says in his teachings on behavioral genetics. He's a preeminent behavioral geneticist. But we only deal with what is, not necessarily what could be. What could be, we leave open. What is, it is what it is. So, at any rate, thank you for tuning in, and I hope this gives you a flavor and just a teaser for why consciousness is so fundamentally important in psychology. We can no longer ignore this. We have to incorporate it into psychology. Self, Soul, Spirit does just that. This podcast does just that. We see this as a continuum. We can go from consciousness to science and understanding biology and evolution and psychology to spirituality and the great mystery. And that we need to incorporate these three dimensions of being in order to have a holistic approach to psychology that is functional, that is adaptive. And the great thing about calling it an approach is that it's open, right? It can change with the science. Self, soul, spirit evolves as we evolve. So we are making these both inductive observations and these deductive conclusions that allow us to grow with the universe and with our shared world of science and our shared world of perception and conversation. And the parameters that we have for the model are there to allow us to build off of what's functional and what is robust in terms of observation. So even the model has its own enabling constraints. Okay, I'm done for today. Listen, this is the podcast. We're going to be doing this. It's coming, whether you're ready or not. So you better get ready. That's another subpersonality in me. 6-year-old boy, wild sense of humor, can't be contained. You better watch out. So that's what it is to be human. So subscribe is what I'm trying to say. Hit that like button, whatever. Just spread the word. Podcasting's awesome. Learn stuff with me. Grow with me. Let's have conversations. Put questions in the chat. We're going to learn all about self, soul, and spirit. And my intention is we go from broad themes, we go from philosophical, we go to scientific, we go to phenomenology, we go to lived experience, we go to how to live a meaningful life, how to live a soul-directed life, so that we're hitting the entire span of self, soul, and spirit in such a beautiful way. So I am going to sign off now. See you later.